I'm interested really that the evening should be some sort of accounting and some sort of archaeology around the concept of difference as and diversity as understood in terms that Tamara puts the issue, that is around the concept of race, and to some extent how that has disappeared from our understanding of the term diversity today, or it emerges in other and mutated forms. In this accounting, I think the concept of diversity is up for some sort of revisionary thinking, up for some sort of examination, and up for an airing. That if we think back to the origins of the use of the term diversity, it was in a very closed field of understanding the world of art, culture, and difference. There was the modernist norm, there was the established kind of universe that came out of colonial modernity, and that began to be questioned by presences of difference in the terrain of, as it were, the colonial power. That notion of diversity often took the form of actual practices, actual artists, black and Asian and African, as we used to say, black, Asian, Caribbean, African, whatever the phrase was of the time, non-white, even ethnic was a term used to understand that emergence of different voices against the backdrop of a solid monolithic view of art, culture, and modernity. It went through great revisions over the course of 30 or 40 years, the first being perhaps when scholars like Eddie Chambers began to document and reflect on this activity, this teeming, seething activity, emerging bottom upwards, one might say, from the ground level, asking to be theorized, asking to be put into some sort of argument. This is the body of activity on which I think someone like Eddie Chambers has reflected in the early days, and his contribution to this field is important, ending up, of course, with his PhD at Goldsmiths College around, and I find the title interesting today. If I remember the title of your PhD, it was about black art activity. The term activity was, to my mind, key in understanding and conceptualizing that particular period, that a lot was going on, diverse, contradictory, highly differentiated and scattered, but it was this dispersal that he was able to bring under some sort of critical reflection, and that bottom-up activity is something that we need to contrast to today, where diversity is very much a top-down kind of concept. So I would place these as two ends of the spectrum in trying to understand the flip over that has taken place in the understanding of the term difference, diversity. In the 80s, of course, we spoke largely of critical difference. By the 90s, in more governmental and official language, of diversity. In the 80s, diversity was seen as rather a negative, rather a more regimenting, controlling ideology of difference, in which people were treated as multicultural essences, quite separate from each other and forever, as it were, repeating their cultural essential identities in isolation from each other. The notion of critical difference was about translation, about interaction between differences, and therefore a far more dynamic and far more questioning kind of understanding of the concept of difference in cultural terms, that we are not stuck with differences. Differences create the productive and as it were, fertile ground for new elements, new possibilities to emerge. And it was that emergence of difference, rather than static and ready-made a difference, that was the bone of contention in the period. That glance, of course, by 1997 at reinventing Britain and the work of Fanon, these questions were to be given once again their political edge, which to some extent we need to talk about today, as diversity today has become the key term of all governments who wish to defend, on the one hand, a kind of broad secular culture against what they see as the rising tide of fundamentalist perspectives. And so in the name of diversity, a certain kind of difference is cordoned off, patrolled and kept out. The second key element in the understanding of diversity today is that it has to be understood against the backdrop of the migrations. That if we take the figure of the migrant, as Hannah Arendt and later Habermas were to establish as the key iconic elements of 20th century culture, then the migrant features heavily in contemporary cultural experience as the deterritorialized figure, this deterritorialized figure who is often interpreted as a figure bringing in creative difference and newness, or is to some extent caught up and controlled in the concept of diversity as a tamed version of difference. What I was hoping then in listening to the three speakers, beyond Eddie Chambers, who is a fellow here, a research fellow at this institution, whose work has, and is also a lecturer at Emory College in Atlanta, and a writer in residence at Spike Island, which are as it were, activities that come together in his long-standing reflection and engagement with the concept of diversity and difference. Beyond him, Richard Hilton, who is curator here at the gallery at London Metropolitan University, who has done several important exhibitions, some reflecting or touching on questions of diversity without quite appearing to address it in the stereotypical way in which that term might be understood in everyday use of the term. He is also writing a work and which is called, I'm trying to work out, Cultural Diversity and the Visual Arts Sector, a study of policies, initiatives and attitudes. And this publication, it would seem, is a further contribution to our attempt to unpack what we understand by the term cultural diversity today, to what extent we have to reach back to understand its historical provenance and forms of usage over the last few decades, and to what extent now it has become such a generalized philosophical, political, cultural term for the European Union as a whole, that we need to step out of Britain to some extent to understand how this has become the rationale of the contemporary political state in its attempt to create the citizen of the 21st century, centered around the notion of diversity. But what does diversity actually mean? We ask Tamara